Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought we could start this conversation tonight actually with talking about a question that really vexed me when I was first kind of deconstructing, which is like something I'm much more knowledgeable on now. And maybe for some people, like this is just like not even a question, but for me, this was something that was really hard for me to get over. I really couldn't understand, and this sounds so silly saying it, but I really couldn't understand how somebody could be quote unquote good without God. Okay. And what I mean by that is like not that people couldn't be good and not be Christians, but couldn't like, fully be good when answering this question. So yeah, I couldn't figure out how people could fully be good without being Christian on some level, because I thought Christianity and the systems of morality, I guess, or its axioms of morality was like the highest ideal. But for me, this question really began to fall apart when one, you had to figure out which kind of Christianity, because there's like a billion different kinds of Christianity, but also like pretty much since the turn of the 20th century, there's been so much literature on like secular form. I mean, even before that, but most, broadly, there's been a lot of literature past, the 1900s on, morality and what that looks like in a secular form. So I thought we could talk about that a bit. How you feel about this idea when Christians say that we just can't be good without God, or that ethics is just unattainable without some sort of, Christian ethic or God ethic built into your system.
Right. I think that is definitely the wrong approach to take. Like all it requires is kind of move away from the perspective is really do the work and reading the philosophy. It's the other way around. It's religion borrows on certain ethical intuitions, but it isn't the source of them. You find already moral concepts within the religion and then expand it. But it's funny that atheists have their morality called subjective, when in reality it's the other way around. It's like it's from their perspective that if what is moral is what God says is moral, then it's actually the definition of subjective morality is subjective to whatever God says.
Sure.
From my perspective, morality is dependent on facts that we can learn about consciousness in the context of well-being and suffering, which I don't think are arbitrary concepts. I don't think the words like good and bad are arbitrary. I think they're descriptions of different kinds of states. And so when we're talking about oughts in any context, we're talking about what kind of steps we can take to achieve certain goals. And in the moral context, they are steps related to how can we live our life, how can we interact with the other, how we can organize our society to move us towards a state of flourishing as opposed to a state of suffering. And so, for example, I don't really buy the whole is-ought problem. Like, I don't think, which essentially says that we can't derive an ought from an is.
Right.
I don't really buy that. Because really what we're always talking about when we're talking about oughts are reflections of is. Like we examine a state of being, and then we examine what steps we take to reach that state. It may be true that logically, like just on pure logic, we can derive one from the other, but that's just applying the wrong tool in the wrong conversation. So I think that is kind of a misconception people have there. I think the moment that you will acknowledge that consciousness has a structure, that the nature of our experience has a structure to it, it's not arbitrary, it's not random, that there's a nature to how we experience the world, then we can examine that nature and arrive at the conclusion that suffering is a real state of being, flourishing is a real state of being, and our values based on those states are not arbitrary. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me to suggest that somebody could value suffering until they're dead. Even someone who may be a masochist, there's a relationship there where, it's pleasure and pain. There's a connection there, but I'm talking about something deeper, not just pure pleasure and pain.
Okay.
Talking about something that's
Yeah, that's interesting. So, because I think even in the atheist community, there is a divide on how people view issues of ethics, of morality. Like, if you ask any Christian, I think most Christians are going to say, no, morality is objective and it's based on, God's law or God's will or something like that. But you don't see that that kind of cohesion with people in the secular world. So I happen to think, I think a lot of people assume otherwise because my name is Objectively Dan. I'm a bit more on the ethical subjectivist side when it comes to like this conversation, because I agree with you that I want to prevent suffering. And I think that suffering can be objectively, modeled in some ways, right? Like we can identify states of suffering and we can examine that and we can, agree on those facts. But where I defer is this idea that, at the end of the day, what we call something good or bad is ultimately based on interests, particularly human interests for a lot of time. And some people might find that confusing because, we do things that may not seem in our own self-interest all the time. We talk about acts of altruism, but there is some kind of interest that's being gained there. For one, the view of wanting to be altruistic is one particular ends for that. Another one is a sense of self-consistency. I like to have an ethical system because that's consistent with myself, that makes me psychologically healthier rather than one that's inconsistent. So I don't know. I go back to this idea that I really think a lot of morality boils down to human interests or just self-interest, and that's hard for me to get around. Because and one last thing on that I'll say, because it's like if I was to convince somebody who is diagnosed as a sociopath, right, like medically diagnosed, that ethics is objective, could I convince them of that? Could they follow that? Would they have any care to do that? Because if they don't have that interest in that, then it almost seems like there's just no argument there, if that makes sense. But maybe you can just completely blow me apart and make you look silly. I don't know. Oh, see, you there? Oh, there we go. We kind of lost you for a second. Go ahead.
So yeah, definitely put it all up there on the table. So let me start from the last thing you said backwards.
Yeah.
Whether or not a person agrees is not really, from my perspective, relevant, because people might reject scientific facts, right? But it doesn't make them not true. Now, I actually agree with you in part that yes, there is a level of self-interest within moral frameworks. Of course, there is. Like, yes, we have an interest in not suffering till we're dead. It doesn't undermine the objectivity. If we look at how the interest plays into the nature of how we experience the world, as long as it's I'll say this as well. There's a confusion of terms that I often hear between relative and subjective. Everything that we experience is subjective.
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that there isn't an objective way to talk about it. Like if you and I look at a glass on a table, we're experiencing that subjectively, but we can still talk about the glass on the table in objective terms, even though we're experiencing it from two different points of view. Relative is something else. It's essentially saying that there is no real grounding, anything goes. And as far as the coherency of the religious perspective, for them to say that morality is objective, and then in the same sentence say that it is dependent on what God says, that is a contradiction, because that framework is inherently subjective to God's desires and God's wills. It can't, by definition, be objective.
Sure.
So, the example of the psychopath, the sociopath, it may be true that there are certain states of being that the person who's suffers from psychopathy or can't access. I think even they have some sense of self-preservation usually.
Sure.
But I don't really see it as a problem for my framework, because it's like saying does pain not exist because there are people who have pain disorders? That doesn't really follow in my mind. Like there may be certain outliers, but the outliers don't really undermine the sort of my argument here is that there is a nature that applies to those that can experience those things. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that that is really a problem for my view.
Okay, I see that. Yeah, I guess like, if nobody had any self-interests, could ethics exist? That's what I wonder. If we were all basically about as self-interested as rocks, would ethical systems even matter? Could we say that there are actions that are right or wrong? And I would say no, because ultimately we care about people's interests, and that's what determines why we can determine some acts to be morally good and some acts to be evil. I think that me killing you for just out of the blue would be wrong because you have an interest in living. But if you had no specific desire to live one way or the other, like anybody else, I would almost say that that the idea that something is good or bad almost falls apart. It would be the same as hitting a rock. The rock doesn't care that I would hit it,
Sure.
So I go back to this idea that ethics seems to come from interests.
I don't disagree, but I don't think that it coming from interest undermines its objective nature. Like, yes, obviously, if we didn't have the capacity to experience or have desires or experience suffering or well-being, it wouldn't matter. But that's what it means to be conscious, right? Which is why I move it beyond just human interest. Like the moment that we recognize another species has the capacity to suffer, then it becomes an ethical concern.
Oh yeah,
for us.
I'm with you on that part.
So yeah, so I don't really disagree with what you're saying about interest. I just don't think that undermines the concept of objective morality.
I guess we both agree that ethics involves interests. Sure. Or conscious beings' interests, because I think we're both on that.
Absolutely,
we're on that front. I think what we differ on is whether that makes it subjective or not, because like interests have to exist in order for ethics to exist. I think that's true. Would we have to say that science wouldn't exist unless interests exist? Or I don't know. I'm trying to think of like an equivalent here because I don't know. It's a strange thing to me that if you just tweak this one thing about reality, suddenly ethics as a whole doesn't seem to make sense, right? And that one thing being people's interests.
But what matters is the reality of the fact, right? Like the fact is that we are conscious, we have the experiences that we have, and we have the interests that we have. So I care about what is the case. The hypotheticals of potentially removing it from the totality. Well, then, by that logic, we can do it with anything, right? Like, well, yeah, we would live in a different universe if we could change, X, Y, or Z. But let's look at the universe that we are in, and what we can say about the universe given the circumstances.
I see. So you're saying that the fact that people do have interests, actually, that's what makes morality objective. In some sense.
And also because if we look at our nature and how we experience, we'll actually find that we're not as different as we think we are. Now, there are belief systems that get in the way of that, right? Like when people believe that, well, you have to do, if you have to kill a certain amount of people to get into heaven, like as a hypothetical.
Sure.
Well, then, yeah, their interest gets recalibrated in this, obviously, from my perspective, very immoral. But that is only because they don't have access to higher states of well-being that we will be able to point to. To say that, no, actually collaboration with the other, having respect for their freedom of will, valuing evidence in the way that we approach reality, as opposed to believing based on wishful thinking or what is fed to us through culture. Having, like, I think it's possible to say we can have better values. The values aren't arbitrary, that you can compare and contrast different sets of values and say why some are better and some are worse.
Right. So that's another thing too. And we'll touch on this briefly before we get the calls here, because we are running out of time in the first 20 minutes. I was wondering if we were going to have enough time or if we had enough to talk about. But here we are getting to a whole conversation here. But like, it's like, yeah, this is what the religious person will bring up, right? They'll say, well, how can you have morality, or how can you say that morality is objective if everything is just based on your own interests, right? This is their big thing, because everybody can have different interests. Like you said, somebody's interest could be that they want to get to quote unquote heaven, and in order to do that, they may have to make some sort of sacrifice, right? It's like, but if I don't see things that way, if I don't think that that's a real thing, or if I don't even care about heaven, then suddenly my view of what I think is right or wrong shifts. So I think that's what Christians kind of point out as what makes it subjective.
Yeah, but well, it's both subjective and objective. It's subjective in the sense that we all experience our nature subjectively, but it's objective in the sense that we have a shared nature. The Christian has to answer how it can be that anything goes if consciousness has a nature to it that we can discover and point to and analyze. They have the same problem. Like, they are also concerned with well-being and suffering. They're just extending those notions in the context of heaven and hell. Yeah, that, from my perspective, is unnecessary. They're making their framework is similar, but they're making more assumptions, and also they're sometimes conflating. I think they're ultimately wrong about what will lead to well-being and suffering, because they're kind of basing it on these traditions that are actually inherently problematic and outdated and messed up. But
yeah, see, and I would agree with you that they are outdated and messed up and stuff. I think it comes with how do I sufficiently argue that to somebody without admitting, at least on some level, that we're talking about my personal values, right? Because I value science, I value reason, but that's something that not everybody values. So it kind of, you see what I mean? It kind of runs into a wall a little bit.
But ultimately, whether or not you can convince, it's like saying, how do you convince someone that to value evidence if they don't value it? Whether or not a person believes in gravity or not is not relevant, because it still is the case. So it's, I'm not necessarily interested in convincing somebody to have my values. It depends on whether or not they value evidence in the first place, and whether or not they value suffering and well-being in the first place. And if they don't, that's fine, but then they can't be said to be talking in the moral sphere. It's like saying, let's think about the concept of health, right? Like, you can't pretend like you're talking about health if you have happened to define health as, drinking poison until I'm vomiting and I'm dead. Like, that's just not how we apply the words.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great conversation here. Very interesting. I'd love to hear what other people have to say about this, whether I'm a big dummy or whether you guys agree with Ceasetoknow. I'm always fascinated by this stuff.